Excellent, good. So just coming in here. Good evening, Martha.
Hello.
How are you, all right?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. Not too bad at all. Oh, I've just got to mute myself here 1 second. Just want to do that. Excellent, good. So we're in the room, just waiting for people to come in. Say hi when you come in, everybody. So we've got the wonderful Martha Priddle here this evening, and I'm really looking forward to this. We've had a chat before, of course, Martha, and I think there's a lot of things that we're going to be able to unpack and discuss tonight. So let people know, I've got a bit of a tickly throat, so I might have to just mute myself and have a little cough or whatever. Good, I got people coming in now. Great, brilliant. Just say hi when you come in. Good to see you all here this evening. Good. Hi, Jason. Hi, Jason. Nice to see you. Oh, good. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Good. Brilliant. Martha, great to see you.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Well, it's an interesting topic, isn't it? Because I think what we're going to unpack a little bit is how we can work with our clients in a more supportive, cooperative way, where there's been a lot of pressure, I think, on the notion of compliance in the past. I've seen some, teaching schools in the past putting this notion of client compliance. How do you get your client to be more compliant? And also, hi Mary, also putting emphasis or pressure on the professional to somehow take the burden of that compliance, when there's so many different things that can make it hard to get the client to kind of fully come on board and on board with things. And so we've got a lot of things that we need to kind of unpack a little bit. So let's start off though with a little bit about your story, Martha, about how did you come to working with dogs? What do you do now? And how did you get this interest? What made you start thinking, we've got to do things a little bit differently with our clients?
Yeah, so I started working with dogs back in 2014 when I was 14 years old. So pretty much a child. My neighbor was a dog trainer, and I refused to leave her alone. So I followed her constantly, went to all her puppy classes, did a lot of agility work with her and her dogs, got registered as a junior handler, and ran some of her dogs in just fun little fun trials. And through that, I learned a lot. That was very much training that utilized both positive reinforcement and punishment methods. But what I took away from a lot of it was the positive reinforcement stuff. So I did that for about 3 years with her. And then I moved away from university and kind of left the dog world for a little bit before I got a job working in a daycare. So working in an environment with 30 dogs in one room really forces you to start learning body language and learning management skills and handling skills very quickly. Because if you don't, you have 30 dogs in one room in a not so great situation. And then from there, I kind of realized that I really did want to stay in that industry, that I wanted to move more away from the science lab side of things, which is what I was doing my degree in. And more into the training side of things. So I started taking continuing education through the IAABC, a couple of things through the PPG, just kind of sources from all over. Some of my university courses kind of worked into training as well, where I took some in learning theory, as well as physiology courses. And then I eventually went on to take my ADT exam through the IAABC to become an accredited dog trainer. And that was just in December that I got that back. So very exciting. And now I work in a shelter. So now I work as dog care staff in an animal shelter, which is a really rewarding job in the sense that you get to see a lot of animals find new homes, but also very hard in that we see a lot of hard situations, both behaviorally and health-wise. A big part of why I kind of had started thinking about this topic is a lot of the continuing education I did, like you said, focused a lot on client compliance, how you can get the client to comply, how you can get them to do things. And I found that a lot of it was really focused on setting boundaries as a trainer, saying, if you do this or you don't do this, you're not going to get the results, which I think having those boundaries is important, but I also think it's important that we look at the pet parent's perspective. What do they need? How have we taught them? Have we given them the skills that they need to help their dog? And so I've kind of been trying to adjust the way I look at it to fit more into that picture.
Great. Well, that's definitely what we're going to look at unpacking. And then just a big shout out to everybody who's working in rescue at the moment, shelters, because I know it's a tough time, right? I think
It is.
you were saying, you know, there, and a lot of shelters are full, and often they're the dogs with some of the more challenging care and support needs. It's a difficult time.
Yeah, I can't imagine how the larger shelters do it. We're a rather small shelter. Our capacity is under 20 for dogs. I can't imagine how the shelters who have hundreds of them manage.
Yeah, it's a tough time. It's a big shout out to anybody who's involved in the rescue shelters. You know, I'm going to be doing a conversation soon with just on working and rescuing and the shelter side of things soon. And you know, I couldn't do your job, Martha. I work with shelters and rescues. I help out, I pop along, I give some education, I go in and see things, but I'm not there all the time. And it's a tough job. It's a really tough job. And actually, my husband, he's an end of life nurse, which a lot of people would see as being really one of the tough jobs.
Yeah,
He couldn't do your job either. He says that to colleagues of ours who work in the local rescue. He's like, God, how do you do it? So I think it just shows what a tough job you guys have. And thank God you're there for these, you know, often very vulnerable dogs and obviously other animals. Is it a multi-species shelter you work in?
it is. We have, we're mostly cat orientated. So we do have a lot of cats. The East Coast of Canada has a rather large feral cat population. So we see a lot of those coming in. And one of the lowest spay neuter rates. So we see a lot of that. And then we take dogs as well. We do also occasionally see other small animals like rabbits, guinea pigs, that sort of thing. But for the most part, it's cats and dogs.
A big shout out to the rescue shelters, and thank you for what you do there. And like you say, it's interesting when we start thinking about a shift from a task orientated view to more of a care orientated. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, because we need to do the same for humans, right? But I think when you work in a shelter, even though you have a lot of pressures to do the task of stuff, you really recognize the care stuff, because you've got these dogs, they're all different, they've all got different stories, they've all got different things that are affecting them. And you know, you really learn a lot, don't you, about the individuality of a dog's experience and story?
Absolutely. I mean, we do have to be careful because we have to balance our time where we have so many animals to look after, but you have to look at those dogs as individuals, because while something might work for one of those shelter dogs, another one, if you do it, it might put you in a very dangerous situation. So
Yeah,
you have to
sure.
watch out and really take mind to look at what that dog needs.
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. So before we come on to what we're going to talk about then, what I'm interested in a little bit is, because you're quite new to the community, which I think is always an exciting thing, because you know, it's a fresh pair of eyes coming in, kind of, you know, old timers like me, we kind of slog through all the changes that they come along, and that's got its advantages sometimes as well, because you've got a bit more, you know, the experience of seeing things over a long time, but that's not always a helpful thing, I can tell you. What was it then that made you see these things and think, is there something about your own experience, your own learning, your own kind of experience growing up, or anything there that made you think, actually, we do need to think about the individual and what might be a bar to them of learning things in a way, or being able to do things in a certain way? Is there something from a personal point of view that made you think, yeah, we need to move away from a compliance model?
Yeah, I mean, for me, a big part of it was that I'm autistic. So my learning styles and the ways that I process information tend to be very different from how other people do. So one example is with a lot of tasks, if I don't understand the why, I can't do it properly. It's not that I want to be stubborn or difficult. I need to know that reasoning. And that was something that, like, through middle school, through high school, that wasn't really acknowledged ever. And it was just, you need to do these tasks. This is how it works. This is the way school is. You have to do them if you want to get good grades. And so that kind of, like, when I heard those things in the dog training world, it kind of made me think back to those same things and how unhelpful that was, and how it really didn't help me do anything. And I think it's kind of ironic too in the dog training world, because we spend a lot of time avoiding the word compliance for dogs, giving them choice, giving them different options. And yet we're so insistent on using compliance for our clients as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that with us. And, I think a lot of the things, a lot of our own experiences do help to define us and guide us to how our perceptions are around things. And what I found with all these conversations I've had and speaking to other colleagues as well, there's two ways into having a different perception shift to the behavior of dogs, the behavior of humans. One is because you get influenced by others, where you think, actually, I'm going to rethink, or your own lived experience says to you, there is no such thing as a comfortable conformist norm.
Yeah.
We're pushed into that. And this is something else that I think is relevant here when we think about working with clients and what you've shared with us about your own experience. This is where unhelpful labels come in. Oh, she's difficult. She's lazy. Whatever we might perceive, the assumptions we make because the work hasn't been done, because something hasn't been, when we see them again, it's easy just to jump at those negative labels. And I'm sure you might have experienced those kind of things at school. We think about a lot of children I know who are kind of labeled as being difficult, disruptive, whatever.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm.
And it's another part where I think that irony comes in, because as trainers, we spend so much time telling people not to label their dogs as aggressive or as stubborn. And yet we all do that for our clients. I think most dog trainers do that for their clients at some point. And I think part of it is that, like, we're all dog lovers, so we all want to do what's right for the dog. And a lot of dog trainers they're dog lovers, they're not people lovers. And so they kind of forget about that side of things, and myself included too. Like, I find myself slipping into it sometimes as well. So I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that and be mindful of it when we're doing it.
That's such an important point, and I think that's definitely the case, I think, for many who struggle with peopling. So they work with animals, great. And I think back in the day when we had a very, very strict kind of operant model for training, like, this is your training, get on with it, and a very kind of expectational element of what clients must do and not do, you could hide behind not being very people-y.
Yeah.
Actually, as we move forwards and as we kind of really embrace this more kind of holistic, progressive, whatever you want to call it, kind of view of just looking at things in the round a little bit more, we have to kind of face up to some of the reasons why we struggle with that and find our own coping mechanisms, even if we're not particularly good at these things, because in order to get those really best outcomes, true communication is at the core. And communication is, in essence, a two-way thing. It's not just a directive thing in one direction.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the first things that I'm looking at with my clients is, tell me about your dog's issues and what you need help with there, but also I want to know what you need help with in it. So why is this a problem for you? Why do we need to fix it? Because one, it might be that it's not a problem for them, actually, and they just have been told that it's a problem and so they should fix it, in which case you don't need to if you don't want to. Like, if the dog barking at the window doesn't bug you, you don't need to fix that just because people tell you you do. But also, it might not be that it's the dog barking at the window that's really bugging you. It's the dog lunging at the window. So, okay, let's find a different way to do that. So I think it's really important to figure out what they actually want help with. Otherwise, we're just spending a lot of time doing stuff that's not going to be productive for them. And then, of course, they're not going to do all the work because it's not helping.
No, and I love that. Even just asking questions, how does that affect you? What's your experience of this? Why do you feel you need to change it? And that's such a powerful way to start, I think, because that opens up a lot of different avenues, for sure.
Yeah.
Because even there's something as simple as them saying, well, actually, it doesn't bother me, but it really bothers my husband. Or it doesn't bother me, but when my daughter comes, so it gives you a framework there about what's happening. But also, I think sometimes clients aren't totally sure what they want either, actually, fully. They know what they don't want, for sure, and they know how it makes them feel, often negatively, because they get frustrated, angry, upset, embarrassed, whatever it is that they're experiencing. So that's a really good place to start, I think, to kind of find out about those things, and asking those questions is a good place to start. What is it that, what are the kind of things you might look for when you're asking those questions with the client?
I mean, yeah, a lot of the time I'm looking for what is actually causing the problem. Or what exactly they think the problem is, like I said, because what they think is the problem really might be very different from what they initially told me. I've had clients who I'm brought in for reactivity, like generally just reactivity to things. And really the problem wasn't the reactivity as a whole. They were managing the reactivity on walks and stuff, no problem. What the issue was reactivity when people entered the house and the dog's reactions towards that. So finding that out beforehand meant that I didn't spend a whole bunch of time making a plan for something that they didn't need. And I was able to make a plan for what they did need, which one usually makes them happier because I'm not wasting their time on something they already know. But two, makes my life a lot easier because I don't have to spend extra hours doing stuff. I'm also usually asking, like, what are your time constraints? What resources do you have? Who else is in the home that we need to work around as well? Because I think those are all really important things to consider. If I give them this long training plan, it's going to take them ages to implement every day or use resources that they don't have, they're not going to be successful in implementing that.
Yeah, so let's unpack that a little bit, because that's a big bit, I think, that's the crux. And I love what you said there also about how it can be more efficient for us as the professional, actually, to really home in on the kind of client need, so we can start that as a foundational thing. Obviously, when we come around to learning from the dog, we might see more needs, but to start that as a starting point is really powerful. And I think even asking somebody, I find with a lot of my clients, just by asking them, well, how does it make you feel? How does that make you feel? They're surprised to be asked that, actually.
Yeah.
And it gives them permission to really tell you, and many people do. They're looking for an opportunity to really share how it makes them feel, because they feel a bit guilty about feeling negative about their dog sometimes.
Oh, 100%.
And it gives them that opportunity to create a relationship with us. It's already starting with a point of, I'm here to listen.
Exactly. And I do think that helps too, in the sense that if they're more comfortable with us, then they're going to give us more of that information that we need as well. If they're telling me that they're super upset by their dog's behavior in the moment, one, I know that maybe their reaction to that behavior is not going to be ideal that we need. And two, I know that then I can tell them that they are not the only ones who experience this behavior with their dog. Because when I most often hear it, it's about reactivity. My dog's reactive. I'm like super upset. It's super embarrassing. People are going to think I'm terrible with my dog, et cetera, et cetera. When really, there are so many people with reactive dogs, and then most of them feel that way. So I think there's a lot less people judging them than they really think that there are.
Yeah, and this is really important. I like that point there, actually. I'm making some notes here because there's a few things we have to go back to. But we as professionals, we dip into these dogs' lives, people's lives momentarily. We might see them an hour a week, maybe, or maybe a bit more, or whatever it is we do. For us to expect them or invite them, really, because we got to move away from expectation, but to be doing these things, we've got to have a good understanding about why they can or cannot do them.
Yeah.
Because for the 99% of the week, we're not with them. And it puts a huge amount of pressure on them, I think, each time. And I think we can lose the relationship very quickly if they at least haven't had a chance to share things. One of the things I have on my initial support notes are the identified challenges that I start off with by inviting the caregiver to let me know how they perceive those challenges to be, whether it's for them, whether it's for their dog, even if they're a bit pessimistic. Quite often the challenges, when I ask people that, the challenge is my dog's never going to change, or whatever it is they want to have. And then I can put my perceived challenges and that's all they are. They're not blocks. It could be size of the dog, difficulty of the problem, the location, all these things. We have to bear in mind all this stuff. And I think it's important just to kind of get these things up originally. Diane just asked in the group, actually, it's a good question here. If somebody starts off with a client asking you, how long will it take, as a direct question, how would you kind of manage that kind of response and the expectations that invariably are loaded by that question?
So for me, I think it helps that I don't do an intake form. The initial intake process that I start with new clients is I give them a consultation call that's about 30 minutes, and we do it for free, where I get all the information that I need about them. And I also give them a chance to ask me any questions. And that is almost always one of them, is how long is it going to take? Yeah. I'm very upfront with people about the fact that I cannot give them an exact timeline, that how long it takes is going to be partially up to them. It's going to be partially up to their dog, in how quickly they learn. And it's also just going to be partially up to chance, because there are variables that we have that aren't under our control. I will give like very rough outline timeline and saying that like reactivity training is going to be something that you are probably going to work on for the rest of your dog's life, but you might be able to see improvement within a few months. Or like recall, I prepare people that to have reliable recall, you're probably going to be working on it for a few months before I'd even say let your dog off leash. But my honest answer to most is I can't give you an exact timeline. I can't make you guarantees, because I don't think that that's a responsible thing to do, because there are so many variables that aren't going to be under their control or my control. Yeah,
that's really good. And I think front loading stuff with clients and supporting our answers, you know, I don't do training as such, but I do behavioral cases. So when I like you're right, that's one of the first questions you asked, how long is it going to take?
Yeah.
And I know that that's coming from a place of them thinking about some kind of fixed dog, some kind of result. So I turn that on its head a little bit, and I will often say, do you know what, the first part of our process, which is learning about the dog's care and support needs, and for me to learn from you, I reckon we could really get a good idea of that in the next 3 or 4 weeks. So at least they have a time in their head, which is just us learning without us. So I think that's really important. And I would say to any caregivers that are listening in, if you do have a professional who is guaranteeing you, you know, by the end of today, your dog will be doing this and that, just be a bit cautious about that, because the guarantees are difficult. And okay, that's really good. Okay, good. So thank you for that, Diane. And hi, good to see you here this evening. Good. So when we think about then trying to have more of a cooperative relationship with our clients, what is it that we have to be mindful of for us as the professional? Because we talked about boundaries, having professional boundaries earlier, and I think they are important. I educate about that a lot in my emotional health workshops for professionals. But boundaries shouldn't be barriers to unmet needs of others. And I think that's something we've got to be careful of, isn't it, when we start thinking about what those barriers might be in relationship to our relationship with our clients. So what things do we have to be mindful of, do you think, when we turn up to work with a client?
So for me, it's one, being mindful that I'm not judging them for certain things. Like if they have not met their dog's needs so far, I don't want to come in judging them for that, because it could be that they didn't know, or they do know, but they're bringing me in to help them do that because they just don't know how to do it yet. And so really making sure that they know that I'm not there to judge them for those things. I'm there to help support them in those things, I think is a really big piece of it, because immediately if I go in and they think I'm judging them for things, that's immediately going to break any trust that they have in me to give me information. And that's completely counterproductive to what we're trying to do. The other one is just, again, making sure that I have a picture of what they can and can't do, so that I'm not giving them instructions that are just obviously not able to be implemented by them. So if there's someone who has like severe arthritic hands, I'm not going to be getting them to do exercises that require fine motor control, because they're going to really struggle with that. They're going to be frustrated. The dog is going to be frustrated by the activity, and it's not going to get them anywhere. So really just getting a full picture of those ideas is a big part of it for me. But then I also want to try and encourage them to be a part of the process as well. I like to try and get them thinking about what they think that they could do to help with certain things. I'm there to kind of guide them and help them towards the right answers, but I like giving them a chance to sort of think about those pieces so that they feel that they're really involved in the process as well.
And that's really important, isn't it? I think we can easily just jump in all the time, keep jumping in, but we all have our own different ways of processing information, learning styles, our own ways of kind of having our brain program what's going on. And people have their own little biases. Some people like to see it, some people like to read it, some people like to think about it for a bit. All these things are important. And what you're talking about there actually is important as well, because one of the big things for us, I think, just seeing what you're saying there, is that we have to kind of check our own biases in at the door a little bit, our own, and often our ableist views, actually, presumption that just because I'm able to do it, I'm going to presume you're able to do it.
Yeah.
Even on intake forms, on my intake form, it has a section there for people to share their own sensory learning or physical challenges. It's very rare that I have a client who doesn't use that bit. Sometimes people feel, I can't put that down. And then I learn about it later. But actually, that's not very often. When they have the opportunity to, they think, oh, maybe this person cares about how I do stuff. And it's important to know straight away. And good. Well, I think that's important. Yeah. So us kind of navigating our own biases is really important. And Mary just mentioned in the group here, actually, about needing individual non-judgmental guidance from the trainer. I think that's really important. I love that, actually, Mary. Thank you for that. Non-judgmental guidance as we help people navigate through things. What we have to recognize is a lot of the things that we know about dogs, you and I, and many people in the group, we presume that to be common knowledge, but guess what? It isn't, actually.
Oh, it almost never is.
Yeah, even some of the kind of relatively straightforward stuff.
Yeah. And I think it doesn't help that there is a lot of information circulating online about dogs, and it's really hard to parse through what is and isn't true, sometimes even for trainers who do already have a knowledge base. So for dog owners, it's probably incredibly difficult to find reliable information and know what is correct and what isn't. And so that's always something I'm thinking about going into, is if they're telling me this information that is completely off base, that's because they've seen it somewhere and they think they have a trustworthy source. And it's not that they're just trying to give me wrong information. It's that somewhere along the line, they've seen that, and that's the understanding that they have.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we have to try really hard sometimes, I know, to meet people where they are with their vocabulary, actually.
Yeah.
They're likely to say things like dominance, correction, compliance, obedience. They like to use these terms. And if we're stopping them every time, oh no, we don't use that word anymore. No, this and that, but you keep stopping them all the time, it's going to make them potentially feel less safe sharing anything else that they may know for fear of getting wrong. And the last thing, even for us humans, we have something that's been identified as social evaluative threat, which is our fear of social rejection. So even saying to somebody, can I give you some advice? That's likely to trigger that part of the brain.
Yeah.
And they're going to feel embarrassed, angry, in denial, whatever it is that comes up. So we have to navigate that. So I think getting the thing right and listening to people communicate in the way they do, we are responsible for our language. I don't think we have to worry about somebody else's, because I will hear somebody say those things, great. Then I'll start talking in my language, and then that will become their language when they start to see it and feel it. They'll use the same things like sensitive or support or relief or whatever it is.
Exactly. And that's really important in shelter work as well. Especially, we intake a lot of behaviorally challenged dogs. That is one of the big reasons that dogs get surrendered. And oftentimes when they come in and we get descriptions, we get really outdated terminology. Oh, they're really dominant over this thing. Oh, they're really, really submissive about this. And it's really tempting to stop the person and correct them on their language. but we can't do that because then we might not get the vital information that we need about that dog. So usually it's more like, oh, can you tell me how they're dominant? And just getting them to elaborate on what they think that means rather than just trying to correct them.
I love that. That is so cool because, and I would invite anybody to think about that, because I had a lady a little while ago who was using these kind of terms and phrases and things. And as we spoke together and as we unpacked it together, you know, what she was saying was that she wanted to keep her dog safe.
Yeah.
Because I said to her, I think what you're saying to me is you want to keep your dog safe. Is that right? And she was like, yes, that's exactly. I said, great. That's where we need to start from then. Because a lot of the time people use words, like you say, because they're just they're in the zeitgeist. They're ones that people pluck out, or they're like, say, they've heard it on the telly or whatever it is, you know?
Yeah.
We can take people along a lot better when they start to see the value in the things that they're investing in, rather than start off by feeling that somehow they're ignorant.
Yeah.
They can feel that.
And I find eventually, like, once you do that, then you can start kind of gently guiding them towards the more correct information. I find that the getting them to elaborate on, like, for example, what they mean by dominant, usually they kind of start leading themselves to the correct conclusion on their own. Because it'll be like, oh, they're dominant. Oh, what do you mean by that? Oh, they growl at me and do this when I do this. Okay, what's their body language like? And from there, they're like, well, oh, well, maybe his tail's kind of a little tucked, so maybe he's kind of scared. And then they kind of just start leading themselves into that conclusion on their own, I find, at which point then we can start talking about what might really be happening. But it helps to have the full conversation so that you're not just immediately correcting them.
Yes, that's a really good point then, isn't it? About meeting people where they are with their vocabulary and letting them have that shift themselves. I love that, because in human kind of psychology therapy, we have the 3 A's: awareness, acknowledgement, acceptance. And helping people become more aware of the situation and that kind of thing is our first port of call, really.
Yeah.
We have to start by being aware of their experience, the human, and then we try and find a way to be more aware of the dog's experience. And if we want the person to shift from that awareness to acknowledgement, which is, the acknowledgement might be, oh, maybe my dog isn't being dominant, maybe it's because they're stressed, for example.
Yeah.
There can be a lot of things that put a barrier up, actually, to acknowledgement. There's a lot of cognitive biases that we have, that, you know, a lot of barriers that people might have to thinking that as being an issue. And I think it's up to us to find ways to help them navigate through that to acknowledgement, because ultimately we want acceptance, which is like, okay, I accept this situation, I accept the challenge I have, I see it clearly. And acceptance always gives us best outcomes, of course, because we're not pushing against stuff. So let's think about that a little bit more then. So awareness is a great way for us to invite, and I would say that everything's an invitation. Ultimately, we can't force anybody to do anything.
No.
This is the problem with compliance. It is, you know, if you can totally make somebody more compliant, and there's all sorts of things I've seen, quite in-depth psychological constructs actually that can go into making somebody compliant. But that doesn't mean that they feel comfortable with the process, that they want to do the process, that they're engaged with the process, that they're positively motivated with the process.
I also think it kind of stops them from making further progress. If we're dealing with, I keep using reactivity because I think it has some good examples to lead into. But if we're dealing with reactivity and they don't understand that that's occurring because their dog is stressed, and they just keep implementing like the same 3 exercises that we've gone over, they're not going to open up the same pathways, where if they realize that it's because their dog is stressed, they might start seeing ways themselves that they can help their dog overcome that. Yeah. I
love that, because this is the key, isn't it? If we do support awareness, an awareness shift, then people, that perception shift changes up everything. You know, we have in human psychology, again, this notion that perception is everything. How you perceive a situation, a behavior, how you perceive somebody else, how you perceive yourself, actually, is likely to dictate how you will treat it, how you will act, what you will do. I find that when people, and often that's how we find people, actually, they're stuck in task, the notion of the task, and they're also stuck in the notion that somehow the behavior itself is intrinsically bad or wrong or inappropriate. And that lends itself more then, because our brain's designed to do this, to want us to try and control, change, or, that behavior, and that can often be through correcting, which is why punishment actually is alluring for many. They kind of see that, think, oh, that must be because I perceive the behavior as bad, there must be a consequence for that, because we're so heavily indoctrinated. So shifting their awareness is key, because and also I think it's also worth mentioning on this one, this is brilliant stuff that you're raising here, Martha, because we also have to recognize there are going to be some people that for whatever reason they're going to find that awareness and acknowledgement really hard.
Yeah.
And often that can be because of their own upbringing, their own trauma, their own whatever, who knows what it is. And we shouldn't take responsibility ourselves as professionals for those who, despite our invitation, despite our best efforts to try and support them and hear them, that they still might think, do you know what, I need to find somebody who can do it this way, because that's the way I feel my dog needs to be treated.
Yeah, I agree. Like, we can do a lot to help clients get to that point and guide them towards that point. But at the end of the day, we can't force them into it. We cannot make them like comply to a different viewpoint that they just don't want to have. And I do think that that's kind of where the thing of boundaries comes in, where if really it's been weeks and we're not getting anywhere and they don't want to try anything, then that's kind of where, okay, let's see if there's another trainer who might be a good fit for you. Because this is frustrating for you. It's frustrating for me. We're not making progress. That's the point where we sort of have to move on and try a different angle with someone else.
Do you know, I want to just stop on that a little bit, because that's a really good point. I didn't think we'd maybe get around to tonight, but it's a really important point. So we're talking about how do we make ourselves more available to the experience of others, our clients. How do we become more available to listening to their stories and their needs? That is so important. But we also have to protect our own emotional safety during that process. And I think that's key, because what can easily be interpreted by this is, oh, I must bend over backwards all the time, and I must keep adapting and changing and doing things so I can just get that client to kind of do things. And that can be really destructive, actually. And I think one of the key things for us as professionals is to be really clear in our own mind before we even see a client, what it is we are here to do. What are our defined roles within this about to start new relationship? And there are things that we have to be clear about what our non-negotiables are. We have to have some red lines. We have to be, do you know what, that's just not what I do.
Yeah,
that's not what I can offer you. Then I think it's important to have that conversation, but also recognizing that there are some boundaries that are negotiable, which is like, do you know what, in this case, I see that we can do this. We'll do this. We'll negotiate those things together, actually, so we can move forwards. But that's a really healthy way of looking at it. I think sometimes we do have to protect ourselves. We can't, I've got a client at the moment who I may as well move in with them, to be honest, Martha. But that's the exception proves the rule, really, because if every other client I was doing that amount of stuff for, you'd burn out. But because I have enough in the tank, because I do have good professional boundaries and my kind of professional self-esteem is healthy, then I can do more sometimes. But that's a really good point, I think, that we have to recognize sometimes it's just not going to work.
Yeah. And it's not something I think that we should be jumping into quickly. I think there is something to be said for putting in an effort first. But I also don't think that we should just keep going if it's fruitless, just for the sake of keeping up appearances or feeling that we're obligated to. I don't think we should necessarily drop support completely. So for me, if that's the case with a client, I don't want to just drop support completely on them, because that often leaves them feeling really lost and upset. It usually doesn't look very good for me either. So usually what I try to do is say, here are some options for you moving forward. Here are some other trainers you can contact. You can always contact me again for additional support on some things if you need it, but I think that we should try these other avenues. And that way they still get some support out of it, but I'm still able to keep that boundary of, I can't do this particular service for you anymore.
And this is why it's really important for us to be as aware as possible of that support process, because we should be able to identify some of those challenges early on. Actually, it shouldn't come as a surprise to us 3 months down the line.
Yeah.
We hit a brick wall. And I think that's important. And I love that idea that we're not just leaving people kind of stranded. Of course, if anybody's listening and they're ever feeling in a situation where they feel physically, emotionally, or socially unsafe with a client, you've got to cut ties and do what you need to do. But luckily, they're the extreme cases that are common. Good. Well, I think that's really important for us to kind of put on there. I think our own emotional safety has to be there. And we have something called the range of safety, which again is a human thing. But for me, we have the dog and their physical, emotional, and social safety needs, the caregiver, and often the caregivers, and us. And where we all meet, that's the range of safety within which we can work. It's much better to be upfront and honest. And I think one other thing as well is to be prepared to ask questions. I find if you phrase something in the right way, like one of my favorite ways of framing things is, for example, would you feel comfortable in sharing with me why you feel we can't do that?
Mm-hmm.
Because what you're saying is, do you feel comfortable? Which is always a good thing for the brain to hear. And then, can you share with me it? Because it gives people a chance to tell us. And I think it's worth checking in regularly during the training and support process and saying, this is my plan for next time. And it's quite good to do it ahead of the next session. My plan for next time is, can you see any challenges or things, like anything about that you want to discuss? Rather than just expecting them to turn up without knowing what's going to happen next and what you're going to do. And I want people to tell me things, especially on the behavioral side. We talked about reactive dogs earlier. It's very easy to say to somebody, oh, you need to go to these locations, go somewhere quiet first, for example, somewhere where there's not much going on. Well, for some people, that could trigger some social anxieties for them. You know, the fact that there isn't many people about and they don't feel that safe without being in a public place. Or the opposite, of course. People might think, God, you're expecting me to go into town with my dog and I can barely go into town on my own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why one of my big things is trying to figure out what their needs are beforehand so that I'm not trying to give them those things if they can't do them. And I think keeping in mind those comfort levels, whether it's physical needs or like well-being needs for the person, are really important in the process. And even touching base, you talked about touching base before a session. One of the key things that I do is after our first session, I wait a couple days, a week, and then I reach out and I ask them how they're feeling about the training, how things are going for them. I don't even really ask them what progress they're making with the dog, because 9 times out of 10, they just give that to me. I don't need to ask. They'll just offer it up if you ask them how they're feeling about their training, because they'll tell you, oh, I feel this way because the dog is doing XYZ. And so I find that that's been really helpful in figuring out what additional support they need as well.
Yes. And how much little feedback tells us a lot.
Yeah.
When they're not offering up stuff, or when they're like, yeah, it was okay. That actually tells you it kind of wasn't okay.
Yeah.
Actually, because most people will be really enthused to tell you the good stuff or have been affected by the bad stuff. And I do find that it's a reflection on our relationship that we build up. If we're building up a really healthy, safe relationship, we tend to find clients share more. Early on, we find that they share less. So we're going to keep giving avenues for that. And also, I think not being too arbitrary in what we think we're going to do in a training session. The same goes for a dog, right? You know, in our heads, we might think, we're going to do this today. But we have to make sure, does Rover feel it today? Does caregiver feel it today? And if not, that it's okay. We can do something else. We can do something different. We don't have to do things. If I find a dog is particularly, as I say, I do aggression and reactivity in inverted commas cases. And if I think right at the beginning the dog's not feeling it today, we're not going to do that. But I try and avoid cancelling that session if I can. Sometimes it's the best thing, but actually that can be quite demoralizing for a client. They've come up today and you're like, no, it's just not going to work. We'll see each other next week. There's usually something you can do with that time somewhere.
Yeah.
Even if it's finding a quiet space to have a chat.
Oh, 100%. My focus is usually if I get there and the dog really isn't feeling it with whatever we're doing, they're having a really off day, we then sit down and have a conversation about more history for the dog, some things that they can be doing. Let's kind of look at where your reward delivery mechanics are at. We don't need to use the dog for that. We can just pretend, and sort of fine tuning those things where we have a chance, especially because usually if the dog is into it, those are things we don't often get to cover as much because the pet parents are usually really anxious for me to be doing stuff with the dog.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that. And I think that's where we have to be robust as professionals in having our clear objectives and plans, actually, because there are some, they will come with expectations that we don't know, actually. Funny enough, Diane's just put in the group about assumptions. We assume a lot if we're not careful. We make assumptions about what their needs are. We make assumptions about their expectations. But we don't know until we ask. But also, regardless of that, we need to do what we think is best on the day. And I think sometimes inviting those conversations, and actually a lot of the time, one of the biggest things for a lot of people is just to feel heard.
Yeah.
So on that day, then to talk about other things, like you say, can be really productive, even if it is just that. It's like, okay, you know, we're not going to do this today, but let's talk about this. Let's talk about that. Is there any bit of the process that you want to talk about a bit more, or that you're unsure about? I quite often invite, and remember, everything's an invitation ultimately, clients to share with me about their own learning experiences. I find it really interesting. Many people have had a not so good experience of the education system.
Yeah.
You know, they've struggled with different things. And I think getting those kind of conversations can be helpful in as far as it gives me an idea of their own fears around learning, or their own learning styles and their own experiences. But also, I think it's a good way to kind of connect in about why we put so much emphasis on trying to create safe, comfortable environments in which for dogs to learn, because we all learn best when we're focused, motivated, calm, safe.
And I think that's a question I'll probably start asking people now too, because I do really like that. In knowing how they learn, and also because I feel like that'll prompt them. Asking people how they learn, they tend to tell you what works, but they don't often tell you what doesn't, or what's going to be really bad. And I feel like asking them in that way instead what their learning experience has been, you get more information about what is absolutely not going to work for them. Or even if they don't outright tell you what's not going to work from them, if they tell you that they had a really bad experience in school because they were belittled for not always looking like they were following along directly. Well, I know that maybe if they look like they're being really inattentive, they might be listening super closely. So I'm not going to point that out, obviously. So being able to know those kind of things as well in advance.
And that's why we have to be careful. I think having conversations with people, remember, it's an invitation. They'll share what they feel comfortable with. I've seen I read something a while ago, which was a top tip to get in early, and to kind of, when you have that training class, is to pick somebody out and then get them to try and do things, but you're like, no, in their face, or you're doing this or doing that. From us trainers, we think, well, that's great, because then it shows people what it's like to have that. But we don't know what that's done to that person in front of these other people, for start, but also what it's triggering for them. They're not going to go away thinking, oh, that little bit of humiliation that I felt, now I get how my dog feels. They might get how their dog feels, but they also think that was quite humiliating. So it's not a great place to start, I don't think. And it's amazing how many of these type of methods, if you like, get incorporated in dog training classes to try and show this way of, show a more positive way of thinking. Yeah.
Whereas really we could just take it and take the person and show them how the positive reinforcement works, instead of showing them the opposite and being like, look, didn't that feel great?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, that is the onus on us, actually, when you think about it then. And if anybody can hear stuff in the background, we've got the local carnival that goes along the seafront. We live on the beach here. Oh. So we've got a big carnival going past us at the moment in the background, but you might not be able to hear it. Is that there's so many unpredictable, unknown components to this whole job that we do. It's hard, right?
Yeah.
The one thing we can be sure of is our own self and our own ethical base.
Yeah.
So we can allow stuff to go on around us. It's up to us to stay as regular as we can through that and just keep being the beacon for what we believe in and what we can show. And there's a big power in that, isn't there, Martha, I think? Yeah.
I mean, I think being strong in your own ethics and knowing what your ethics are so that you can hold steady to them is really important. Especially because a lot of the times we have trainers going at each other over it, which can be really demoralizing, I think, in our sphere. I think we tend to be a little bit against one another in dog training sometimes. And if you don't have that like strong security in what you're doing already, it's going to feel so much worse. And I had that problem when I first started, that I didn't know what I was doing. It was really hard to stay in one space, training wise, because I wasn't certain on where my ethics lay. And so it was a lot harder to keep consistent with my training as well.
Yeah. And that's the whole thing about emotional safety for us professionals. I'm running a new workshop on it, actually. I've run a few now, but I've got a new one that I've just put out the date for. It's in the events tab, people to have a look at. But learning who we are, I know this sounds obvious. It's like, well, I know who I am. But do we, think, who am I as a person? Who am I as a professional? What are my non-negotiables? What is it that I will continue to turn up with and as? Because ultimately, we do best through positive representation, not through pointing fingers, shame and blame and having a go at each other. Even professionally, I put my stuff out, and I know for sure everything I put out, there's going to be three types of people ultimately. The people who will love it, and some people will love anything I put out. I could put the phone book out, I'm sure they'll be like, Andy's put out the phone book. Those the other end who will not like it, or potentially won't like anything I ever do, regardless of how good it is. And then those in the middle who are neutral and work it out. So when you know that, actually, you think, do you know what, I'm going to put it anyway, and it's not there for people to. It's always good to have scrutiny about work, because that's a good kind of proper critique is important. But other than that, it's a case of, this is what I believe in. This is what I value. This is my purpose. And that's a really strong shield for us when we turn up to others. For every person that knows you, that meets you, there is a different version of you, because they will all have a different perception of us. So how can we possibly keep warping ourselves around things for working professionals? And this is the other thing about a compliance-based model. It's just an easy way for us to mold the world, that kind of professional world around us, without taking into consideration actually that what might work for best outcomes. It's a relatively, I don't know, lazy is the wrong word, but it's definitely
it's easier.
It's easier. It is easier. It's like, I'm going to expect you to this, Martha. This is what you've got to do. I expect it done by next week. And I'm going to.
I think it takes a lot of the responsibility off the trainer too, because if we're looking at it as a compliance model, we are looking at it mostly as the responsibility of the clients and very little of it on us. And I think it's more of a team effort. It's some of the responsibility is on us and some of it is on the clients, but it's not completely on them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be hiring us.
That's a really good point, because I think that's why we have to be mindful, I think, about what it is that we are there to do, and what our responsibilities are to that process, and protect ourselves in that way, and also recognize what the clients do kind of have responsibility for, because ultimately the dog is their responsibility. They live with the dog 24/7. We don't live with them, so we don't with them. But also what our responsibility is in that process. I think ultimately, though, I feel that and I know people disagree with this when I say this, but this is just, again, what I believe. But I don't think we can, as professionals, be ultimately responsible for final outcomes, because there's too many variables often, and actually we just don't know enough of what goes on in that dog's day-to-day life for us to say, right, I will be responsible for this. And this is, I think, a part of the problem. When I was involved in human therapies, it's easier to be boundaried in a way like that, because it's like, I'm seeing you for an hour, we'll talk about stuff, I'll see you next week. If you don't come next week for whatever reason, that's not my responsibility, you know. The problem is, of course, these flipping dogs.
Yeah.
Because we fall in love with them. And we feel that somehow we've got to make an impossible situation right for them.
Yeah.
But I made a pledge a few years ago, which has protected me, which is, and I don't always keep to it, but that I will only be deeply affected by and cry for my own dogs. Now, there are some dogs that come along that I just do get deeply affected by and cry for, of course, because I'm human.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is ultimately they are my responsibility. They're the ones that I can take ownership of fully the process.
Yeah. No, you can't. I definitely don't think you can't be responsible for someone else's dogs. I just think that we have, in moving away from a compliance model, we have to take some responsibility in our teaching of and listening to our clients. And that part is part of our responsibility. We obviously cannot control what they're doing. We can't fully change their mindset. We can't force them into that, but we can change how we're teaching them and how we're explaining things and how we're considering their needs to better help them.
And keep trying to make the adaptations that are possible, because it's easy, isn't it, to go back to thinking, oh, this is, you know, they're being difficult, they're being late, or whatever it is that we think of, even if we've gone to things initially. And actually, when we start to feel that creep in, that's one of the first signs of compassion fatigue, I think, actually. Which actually, when we think about compassion fatigue, it's not like we have a finite pot of compassion that we can just, when we've used it, it's gone. We can have as much compassion as we like for everybody. But invariably, when we start to feel that and we're less able to keep trying to turn up, it's because we don't have enough compassion for ourselves. I think that's often the sign there that we're wearing a bit thin.
Yeah. And you start blaming yourselves for the consequences, and really taking all the responsibility for that. And that's where it becomes really emotionally draining, I think.
Yeah, very much. Well, this is amazing. The hours flown by, Martha. How about that? So what are some, I think we've covered a lot of different angles to this conversation, actually, about our own care, about our own importance to look after ourselves, as well as trying to turn up for others. And it's hard turning up for others. You know, it really is. You know, we are a care professional, especially on our side of the fence. We care. You know, we don't have enough supervision for us, especially when we work for ourselves. You know, I talked about my husband earlier. He gets supervision every month, so that he can offload and he can talk and he can share and find a safe space to do that. We don't always have that on our side. What's some final words then, Martha? What's some things that you'd like to kind of mention before we sign off?
Really, I just want to encourage people to start challenging the way that they're looking at client compliance as it is, especially those who are acknowledging that we can't really work with dogs on a compliance model, asking why we think that way about people, and how we can change that. And really just thinking about how your intake process can, of course, you still need to focus on getting information about the dog. But realistically, if we're trainers who are going in and doing coaching sessions, we are doing so much work with the people as well, and oftentimes more work with the people than with the dogs. So it's really important to have that information about the people we're working with as well. Yeah,
good point to end on, I think. And well, thank you so much, Martha. Where can people find more about you and what the work you do?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram and Facebook as Pup in Progress Dog Training. And I typically post a lot of just small informational things about positive reinforcement training, but as well as like my clients and their training journeys. And then I'm also on a couple other, I'm on like Instagram Threads and Twitter as Pup in Progress, but to be honest, they don't get used very much. But yeah, that's where you can find more about me. And all the contact information for me is there as well.
I love that name as well, Pups in Progress.
I'm very happy with it. A big part of it for me was that I don't think you can fix dogs. I think they're kind of always in progress in where they are in their training. So that was really important to me that was part of the name and the branding.
And I love that as a final thing, and that's a really profound thing, actually, if we deep it down on it, because we are all dog, human, cat, horse, gorilla, whatever, growing and learning to cope, coping better sometimes, not so well other times, learning to self-regulate, learning to find a way through that we can just continuing that progress. So we're all a work in progress, all of us.
Yeah.
Our dogs are no different, except the big problem with dogs is that they're so reliant on us to be able to help them to get things right, which is interesting. Well, thank you so much for tonight. Some great comments in the group. Thank you, everybody, for joining in this evening and making some good things. I've managed to find a way now of being able to look at the chat whilst talking to my guests. You're the first one I've been able to really do that with, which is
that's awesome.
great. Yeah, it's great. So I can, that's how we can look at this. Okay, guys, so I'm going to be having a little break for a bit. So there will be some more lives. I've got some amazing things lined up soon, but I'm going to be taking a little bit of a break, but there's obviously going to be content in the group. Anybody who's interested in the emotional safety for dog professionals, check out the event tab because I'm running that as a workshop. We've only got a few places left, actually. So they always sell out pretty quick, actually. So that's great. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed having the conversation.
Thank you.